who were some of the women who were important in the social life in that period, since we're talking about them? And did women such as, say, Mary Lincoln, who boarded for a short while with her husband, have any effect on the political calculations of their husbands while in these extra official areas?
Well, the interesting thing about Washington, I think, is that it's really more of a male city. That's part of the reason why I like to call it a fraternity. It almost operates like a fraternity house because the women aren't around as much. When they are there, they do get involved in sort of the day-to-day calling experience. There was all kinds of etiquette in how congressmen and their wives were supposed to interact. And so women, when they came to Washington, if they were on the lowest rung of the ladder, that would be congressmen, that would be people serving in the House of Representatives, would have to call on all the women who were above them. The senators' wives, the Chief Justice and the other Supreme Court justices' wives, the president's wife, the cabinet members' wives. And what they would do is they would spend most of their weekends going around and trying to call on these different members of Congress's wives. And this was meant to serve as a way of getting everyone together to be part of this community. And so as a result of that, the women sort of play a role in the sense of, well, this person's wife visited me, so I'm okay having them over for dinner. But for the most part, the women weren't around. And the most important role that they serve, at least in terms of my book, is letters home. Politicians are constantly writing their wives about things that are happening in Washington. I really wouldn't have been able to write this book without the letters home. The women are so interested in hearing about the politics, and the men just write on and on about all kinds of things that are going on.
Is this mainly areas that has not been used before?
I wouldn't say that. I just think people haven't necessarily thought about the social aspects of the men. It's very easy in our sort of 21st century history to talk about women as social animals. The men have not had as much interest by historians in terms of their social behavior, except maybe in the last 10 years.
Oh, I'm glad that's coming around.
Yeah.
So what is your approach to the understanding then of that social and political life, and how does collective biography and community studies work for you? How do you use it?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do with the book is to talk about how important personal relationships are to understanding history. One of the great things about history in the last 20, 30 years is that people have started to understand institutions better. We understand, for example, how the post office works. We understand how different agencies in Washington work. But understanding how people operate in those agencies is really my concern, and what I think gives us really the great color of history, the stories. Because, of course, the politicians themselves are real people. They actually have real ideas and real insecurities and real problems. A lot of insecurities, by the way, and real faults. And as a result of that, they cause certain things to happen in Washington in the conversations about politics and also about the issues like slavery and other problems that come up in the mid-19th century. And so understanding the people themselves and the way that they interact tells us much more about why things took place the way they did and why people behaved the way they did when conflicts like the coming of the Civil War actually took place.
Well, you grew up next to a shrink. Cousin of mine.
Okay.
Cousin. And my dad was a shrink.
Okay.
So I'm thinking the whole time you're thinking about this, was there a psychological aspect to this bubble of Washington, D.C.? What about the psychology of being there, maybe even individually, for that matter?
Well, I think a couple of things about that. First, I think Washington does something to people when they go there. It gives them a very different sense of what it was like to live in the United States. If you're someone from, say, upstate New York in this period, and you've never met anyone from Alabama or Mississippi before, you're going to have a very particular impression of what those people are like. But meeting them in person and having the opportunity to talk to them and understand where they're coming from, in spite of things you might really not like about them, that's going to change the way that you understand the country and the people from that area. But I also think that there's an importance in the way that people in Washington hold themselves to a particular kind of standard. This is why I like to talk about Washington as a fraternity. One thing about a fraternity, rather than say a friend, is that whether you like someone or not, whether you get along well or not, it is a very particular community that deserves to have everything stay in the family, stay in the fraternity. So whether or not you and I are really good friends, if we're in the same fraternity and you do something sort of inappropriate, I'm not going to go and tell everybody else. I'm going to keep it to myself. Maybe I'll tell my wife, but other than that, it's part of the Washington experience. It's sort of a, to use a really unpleasant term for this, it's sort of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas kind of experience of Washington itself.
Well, I really want to get to something else here, but it keeps begging the question in my mind. Were they listening to the outside? Was this war, here we're going to get into a different area, it wasn't inevitable. I mean, inside there, compromise after compromise, decade after compromise, decade after, and they've been able to, scotch tape together the country.
Right.
So what happens that it goes out of control on them? They felt they could control it, I bet.
That's right.
And it didn't happen. So what happened?
Well, they are so surprised by the speed at which secession takes hold. This is the key to understanding why people like Jefferson Davis, who we think of as the quintessential Confederate, he's the president of the Confederacy, he is appalled by what happens. He decides to leave Congress, and on his way home from resigning his position, he's weeping because this is so sad for him, and he does not really... he has such mixed feelings about what's happening. So I think it's a lot about being out inside the bubble and away from understanding the day-to-day experiences of people outside of Washington. But I also think that secession is not necessarily inevitable. It just happens outside of Washington. Right? It's a rejection of politics. In some ways, it's a rejection of exactly the Washington bubble that these people live in, because they are creating compromise and they are trying to fix certain problems at the same time as fanning the flames of anger through their speeches that are just for their constituents. So as a result of that, you have this group of people, particularly in the Deep South, who say politics are not working. I reject this. If politics aren't going to work, this is not going to work. This democracy that we've built is not working.
Yeah, see, you go and look at Congress today and you think about what's going on, and it broke down once into real civil war.
It did.
I don't see it happening today yet, but they didn't see it then either. Maybe I'm in a bubble myself.
Maybe.
I do want to get back to the letters for a moment.
Sure.
Of the congressman. Were there some that were more interesting to you and more valuable to you to the book than others? And did you go through 200 letters?
Many collections. One of my favorite collections is North Carolina Congressman by the name of David Outlaw, who wrote his wife pretty much every day while he was in Washington, and explained sort of his daily experiences, what it was like to live in boarding houses and go to parties and talk with other politicians. And he talked a little bit about some of the less appropriate behaviors of his fellow congressmen and of trying to bribe congressmen, people throwing women at congressmen and saying, here, why don't you have a nice evening with this woman, and that will give you the opportunity to maybe vote for my bill that I'm interested in. So David Outlaw in particular, he was one of my favorites.
So go ahead with what other letters groupings besides the Outlaws?
Well, there are so many, but another one of my favorites was the William Corcoran papers. William Corcoran was not a Washington politician in the traditional sense. He was a patron of the arts. You might recognize him from the Corcoran Gallery in Washington. But he was a banker and a wealthy landowner in Washington, and he spent a lot of time with politicians. He was very friendly with many people in the area, and he kept very good track of his experiences with politicians in Washington, and particularly the dinners that he had. He had a roll where he kept track of who came to each dinner that he held in the 1840s and 1850s, so you could get a sense of the cross-sectional makeup of all of these dinners, where he's inviting people from South Carolina and Louisiana and Illinois and Massachusetts, people who maybe, if they could, they would avoid each other in Washington. It was hard already. Not at Corcoran's. And if Corcoran invited you to dinner, you went to Corcoran's, because he threw the most wonderful dinner parties. The food was fantastic. It was all very fancy. And if you were a Washington politician, you didn't have a lot of money to be spending on nice food. I had one great story of a politician who lived in a boarding house, and he had mackerel for breakfast for 3 straight months. So going to Washington and having dinner at Corcoran's was a great pleasure for many of these guys.
I'm sorry I missed it. Well, here we're talking about how cozy everyone is.
Yeah.
Yet, it did lead to war.
Of course,
and to something else, a caning, which
That's
we're going to start talking about. But here is a political print that came out that is called The Pro-Slavery Incantation Scene, or Shakespeare Improved. You can see all this, everyone who's here, you can see a little bit later on. Again, it's too difficult to see right now. And on this pot, it says, double, double, free state trouble, till Fremont men are straw and stubble. There's burning underneath, Beecher's sermon, New York Tribune, misspelled Sumner's speech. Buchanan here says, I endorse the laws of Kansas now in force. A slave catcher way on the left there says, and I'll give you his little mantra here, pour in streams of freemen's blood, then the charm is firm and good. To see the blood of freemen spill, to hear the widow's cries so shrill. To know my Kansas-Nebraska bill has caused these woes, to me is joy, here at home in Illinois. And a man holding a cane. So now we'll get to Sumner here. Slips of gallant Brooks' cane, slivered as it fell like rain, on Sumner's head, and shut it up, so fare all foes to slavery's cup. So, yikes.
Yikes.
Everyone knows about the caning of Sumner by Preston Brooks. Everyone here remembers that, right? So what was this crime against Kansas, and why would it lead to a caning on the floor of the Senate?
Well, got to go back a little bit before this. In 1854, Stephen Douglas, famously Lincoln's opponent in the 1858 senatorial campaign in Illinois, decided to push for a bill in Washington called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that would allow for something called popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. Popular sovereignty was the idea that people could vote slavery up or down, the people of the territory. This was sort of a tricky proposition, in part because he never says anywhere in the bill when they would vote slavery up or down. But this bill passes in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Kansas pretty quickly devolves into violence. You have people coming over from Missouri who are pro-slavery people trying to push for slavery in Kansas, and you have people coming from places like Massachusetts and Illinois trying to push for anti-slavery measures in Kansas. And at one point in 1856, this devolves into real violence when pro-slavery people attack the town of Lawrence. It's called the Sack of Lawrence. And there is great outcry throughout the North, and they call this Bleeding Kansas. Kansas bleeding because the pro-slavery people are attacking the anti-slavery people. And this really upsets Charles Sumner. He is, of course, a from Massachusetts and is very much opposed to slavery. And in the Senate, he delivers this very famous speech, The Crime Against Kansas, where he rails against Kansas, what's going on in Kansas. And in particular, he rails against the politicians who are promoting the idea of a pro-slavery Kansas. He uses some very nasty language that upset a lot of people. He talks about the rape of Kansas, and he in particular insults a fellow by the name of Andrew Pickens Butler, a senator from South Carolina who happens to have a cousin in Congress by the name of Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks is a little bit of a hothead. He had been very much involved in the Washington community. He was very well liked. He was a good party man. Party, not in terms of party politics, but more in terms of drinking and going out and carousing. And so he was very well liked, but he did not like this very much. He was very upset. Andrew Pickens Butler had been in South Carolina during this period. He missed Sumner's speech because he was ill. And so Brooks thought in particular this was offensive. That Sumner was going after his cousin because he wasn't even in Washington at the time. And so he got it in his mind that he needed to confront Sumner. And this turned into quite the debacle. Initially, he wants to approach Sumner and have a little conversation with him, but Sumner keeps managing to avoid him, not even on purpose. This is the funniest part about it. Sumner is completely oblivious to the fact that Brooks is unhappy with him, but Sumner avoids him a couple of times, and Brooks gets angrier and angrier, and he starts going out for drinks with his fellow Southerners and getting fairly drunk and getting more and more angry. And finally, a couple of days after the speech, he decides to wait for Charles Sumner in the back of the Senate. Politicians have cleared out of the Senate. They've adjourned for the day. He waits for the last few women to leave from the galleries, and then he approaches Sumner and says something. Historians sort of disagree about exactly what he said, but something along the lines of, Mr. Sumner, you have insulted my relative who is ill and absent in South Carolina, and you must be punished. And he raises his gutta percha cane and proceeds to beat Sumner many, many times. And Sumner is quite affected by this. He's out of Congress for several months. And this becomes one of the biggest ways in which Republicans in the North talk about Southerners as the slave power, as people who are trying to take over the nation and spread slavery to every corner. And what I think is interesting about this in terms of Washington is that politicians in Washington just did not react the same way. They didn't treat it as something that was as upsetting as those in the North and those in the South had. As your as the little thing suggests.
This suggests, a lurid culture of violence.
Absolutely. But Washington was a violent place already. That was part of the norm. It was sort of part of the everyday experience. And by the way, not just in Washington, in the whole country. It was a pretty violent country in this period generally, and politics was a particularly violent experience. Anytime you would go to cast a vote, there would be people there with guns trying to intimidate you to suggest that maybe you ought to vote this way or this other way. So it was a violent nation, but this was a particularly violent period, and it was particularly violent in Washington. And so people in Washington did not react to the caning of Charles Sumner the same way that those in the North and South did. They sort of treated it as par for the course. This happened all the time. There was always violence in Washington. It wasn't, somebody throwing a brick at somebody else. It was much more serious in the sense that Sumner was out for a while, but this kind of stuff happened. And the results of what happened to Sumner and what happened to Brooks give you a good indication of this, because Brooks is not really punished for what he's done. He's immediately reelected to Congress. He comes back, or he doesn't come back, but he's reelected to Congress by his constituents, and there's sort of a feeling of, well, this is what happens.